You can get all the follows you want on X. Does that mean that anyone's going to see your post when you post? Creators don't have agency on any of these platforms. They're completely beholden to whoever is running them. So if they want to build a business, that's just crazy. So there's a real need for these creators to find an alternative to really build something that's sustainable. Nobody's going to want to follow an AI bot. No one's going to want to, interact with a community that's primarily AI, right, driven. They want human connection, right? They want an actual connection to an actual person, an actual creator.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
All right, so this week's guest is Mike McCue, who has been involved in social for about as long as you have, although I don't think you have crossed paths that many times. But the conversation...
No, he's been around actually longer than me. He was an executive at Netscape. He helped build the open web and sort of liberate us from the clutches of the AOL walled garden.
That's right. I mean, so we see these kind of peaks and troughs in history of the web being open and then closed and then open again. And I think one of the things that really struck me in the conversation was how optimistic Mike is about the fact we're on this threshold of opening up the social web. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about that and why you were so excited to speak to Mike?
Yeah, so Mike runs a startup called Flipboard that he's run for a long time. Previously, he was on the board of Twitter and an executive at Netscape. And a couple years ago, Mike really sort of saw how the Fediverse could be used, how these open social protocols, these permissionless protocols that we've been building, that are Bluesky's app protocol, that are Nostr, that are Mastodon, how he could move Flipboard to exist in an open ecosystem, and built a new app called Surf, which is a sort of a social curation app that helps you find and share content from all these platforms. And he didn't just build these apps, but he also launched a podcast called .social that was, an inspiration for revolution.social. The names sort of play off of each other, but also he really got into interviewing everyone who are building this future, this open social future, and trying to understand what's going on and where we're going. And that, I think, is more than just running a company. It's about building a community of people who together are changing the world.
Yeah, and I think that word community really did come up a lot in your conversation. I think it's also very interesting that really up until this point, a lot of your work has been on trying to build communities that work in an open social way. And we're seeing this kind of desire for creators to no longer be so much at the slave of an algorithm, but they want to get closer to their fans, their true fans, the people that show up for them every day. And we keep talking about the fact that being a follower now means that you often don't see that content. And so that came up a lot in your conversation too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this idea that originally if you followed someone, you would see their post, you would see their content. But that's no longer the case with all of these algorithms. And so what does it mean to connect? What does it mean to curate? And how can we design a social media future that is driven off of users having a real relationship to the people they want to follow, that creators have a connection to their followers and they're not just trying to constantly game the algorithm.
Right.
Mike recently joined the board of Patreon, which is sort of the best way in which creators can directly fund their work from their superfans, rather than being dependent on a few alienating large platforms.
Yes. And I think the other thing I'll just touch on before we jump to the interview is the idea that when we are in these like early phases, and, the Fediverse has been talked about now for a couple of years, you've been working on open protocols for many years now, that there tends to be a conversation more about the technology itself rather than the use case. But it does feel like 2026 is the year we're going to jump that chasm. And users will be able to just use this technology the way they want to use it. It's not going to be so complicated to kind of get their head around. They don't need to understand. It will just work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of what the work we're doing with Divine and the work that Mike is doing with Flipboard. You don't have to be a technical person to use Flipboard. You don't have to be a technical user to use New App Surf. You don't have to be a technical person to use Divine. You don't have to understand all of the details behind the scenes. You just have to focus on the experience that you want to either find and share content and read it, or make videos, watch videos you want to see, and have agency over that relationship without having to understand the technology.
That's right. Well, I'll say stay tuned, because we're going to be at South by Southwest in March. Mike will be there. You're there with Rudy Fraser and Bridget Todd. And I think we're going to try and plan something fun and exciting. So for now, let's take a listen to the interview.
I'm really excited to have Mike McCue on revolution.social. Mike is someone who I have admired for many years, someone who for the last couple years has produced a great podcast called .social, looking into this project to bring social media back to protocols, to make the Fediverse real, and really sort of reclaim social media and make it more like the internet that we all wanted. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Rabble. It is fantastic to be here.
You've had a long career and you've done so much, all the way back to being an executive at Netscape and bringing the browser to the mainstream. And that, to me, is really useful to understand where we're at. There's a couple points in your career which I think are really useful for us to talk about. One is the transition from AOL and CompuServes of the world, these sort of walled garden internet services that weren't open, to the world of Netscape, the world of the web. And then you were on the board of Twitter at what I think was the most pivotal time in Twitter's history before Elon showed up, which was when Twitter moved from an open app ecosystem focused on open APIs to trying to bring everything in-house. And I've brought Jeff Jarvis on this podcast where we talked about his experience as Uber Media, where they were the sort of the other side of that conflict that led Twitter to shut down its API. And then you created Flipboard, this open internet tool for finding content and curating content, and an example of the internet we have. And the last couple of years, you've been really working on open social, not the open social that was Facebook 2 decades ago, but like these open social protocols in the Fediverse. And so I'm just so happy to have you on here, because you've been there at these sort of 3 different transition points as the internet opened up and closed down, and now we're opening up again.
Thank you for that awesome summary, Rabble. And, of course, I've been there. You've been there with me in some of these moments in time, too, like particularly at Twitter. And, each of these moments I think of them as defining moments. And sometimes, all times we learn from them. And there are a lot of lessons from each of these moments that now I've incorporated into how we're proceeding with product, how we're proceeding with evangelism, how we're proceeding with, advancing this ecosystem. And so there's a lot of lessons learned. There's some successes, some failures along the way.
Yep.
But that is, that's right. It's played out in as the internet's had these defining moments, as Twitter had these defining moments. All of this is culminating now. And I have to tell you, after all of those, I've never been more optimistic than I am now about how the internet is going to develop and how the social media world and ecosystem is going to develop into a much more open, connected experience for people, independent of app, independent of platform. And simultaneously along the way, thinking through not just how are people connected, how does the user experience work, but also how does the ecosystem actually sustain itself, from a monetization, financial point of view, how does it sustain itself from a community dynamics point of view? There's, building sustainability into this from the get-go is super important.
Before Elon Musk took over Twitter and renamed it X, we had this idea that these platforms might be doing wrong, but people believed them that they were trying to be neutral players. And then Elon took over Twitter. He said that he's basically going to use it as a bludgeon for changing politics. He's going to use it to try and get Trump elected. And then, Zuckerberg and others are like, well, let's get rid of that DEI stuff. Let's get rid of that inclusion stuff. Let's, go all like, alt-right. And ironically enough, that was what convinced people to re-look at the open alternatives. Look at the Fediverse. And I think that part of what you were very aware of the Fediverse for a really long time, but it's what helped encourage you and Flipboard to start investing in it.
Yes, absolutely. That was a really key moment in time where people started to actually think maybe we do need an alternative to these walled gardens, to Twitter, to Facebook. When people started to then look for alternatives, they found Mastodon, and Mastodon was built on ActivityPub. And so then the notion of ActivityPub, which was, created back in 2016, as part, it's part of the W3C, standards bodies. And it is a phenomenal advancement in how social media works, because what ActivityPub represents, and as does AppProto and Nostr, is standardizing the way people are connected on the internet, a standard for human connection. And that is such a powerful concept when you really think about it. Before I joined Netscape, we talked to Mark Andreessen about them buying my first startup, Paper Software. And ultimately, I decided that was a good idea. I would join Netscape. But my friends and other folks I knew at the time thought I was crazy for doing it. They were like, Mike, nobody uses the internet. Nobody, if I want to be online, I just take my CD-ROM and I pop it in and I go on the AOL and I just click on, travel or whatever. And it just works, and with the internet, you have to like download. What does download even mean? And you have to type into like this thing called a browser and put like HTTP. He's like, it's never going to happen. These folks that would tell me like, you're insane. It will never happen. And, that of course we know what happened is because.
But the web was so much worse than AOL. Like the web,
was initially, it was. Yeah, it was incredibly clunky. And but what happened was there was a protocol that connected content and rendered content in an open model that any browser could use. And what that led to were developers and content creators, publishers, everybody deciding, well, wait a minute, instead of me having to go cut a business development deal with AOL to be online, I can go build my own online presence. And so you decentralize the innovation that was locked up inside of AOL. And now you had tens of thousands of developers, content creators doing all sorts of cool things, pushing the protocols even further. And then we had the web. And, if we didn't have that, there would be no Airbnb today. Amazon wouldn't exist. Netflix wouldn't have happened. Like, it's amazing to think about that. But all of that was enabled because we created a common protocol for connecting content. Now we have a common protocol finally for connecting people. And that is just as big, if not even bigger.
Yeah. It's fascinating because it took so long to get from the protocol to connect content, web pages and links, to the one in which we have people connected. It's not like we didn't try.
Right.
We tried. There was, OpenID and a whole bunch of protocols, RSS, and which is still used today widely as podcasting, but not for the original use anymore very often. And, for me to understand how we ended up in this world, we made a deal. We made a deal in 2004 to 2007, which was, we're not going to try and just build all our own software. Indie web, everybody compile it and run it yourself, set up your own servers, which was very, very hard. We're going to use these new smartphones. We're going to use these apps. We're going to provide an integrated experience, and we get to all connect. And the platforms agree to be open enough. And that was Twitter's thing. And this is, Jack Dorsey goes back and says that, his mistake was making Twitter a protocol and not a company. But we tried to make Twitter federated. I don't know if you knew this, but in 2008, we actually built the federation with Jaiku, and the technology didn't work. Like, the only way we could get millions of people on it in a way that worked is as these apps. And you I'm really curious because you were brought on the board of Twitter in, I believe, 2010, and you saw this moment of Twitter going from this very new growing company to trying to figure out what is its business model and what is its, like, how does it establish and how does it deal with competition in the market? I wonder if you could talk about sort of that, what it was like to be on the board.
It was an amazing time to be on the board of Twitter. As you said, they were basically entering this kind of defining moment. Dick Costolo had just become the CEO. Ev was still on the board. Jack was still on the board. And at that time, Flipboard, which we had started just about a year earlier, was one of the largest, if not the largest user of the Twitter API. And we basically saw Flipboard as effectively like a social browser. It connected Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all these folks had APIs.
The era of the
people
mashups
together. Exactly. And there were a number of people who were like building just really cool new experiences with the Twitter API. And I was a huge advocate for that. And so I that was one of the big reasons why I ended up joining the board. And, unfortunately, the business side of Twitter, as Jack talks about, on your first episode, great episode, by the way. I think
Thanks.
That moment where, Twitter's management team started to think in terms of like a walled garden business was when I was there. And ultimately, I also saw like, wait a minute, this API could get shut down. My whole company is built on this API. Now I have a conflict of interest. I'd have to leave the boardroom when they would talk about these APIs. I'm like, okay, guys, this is getting a little too weird. So ultimately I left the board because it was clear I was...
Which is a shame because we needed you to, if the conflict of interest hadn't been there, you could have better advocated for the open thing, which,
yeah,
I think Twitter would have been much better off for.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe I would have been able to prevent Twitter from ever being sold to Elon, which I think was a very unfortunate thing. I view Twitter as had the potential to be the lingua franca of the internet. I really saw that the way Jack talks about it as like, it really started out in his world as a protocol and it became gradually a business. Right. And so, that I think that moment in time was a lost opportunity. Now, what's really great is that, Jack then set about to like, okay, how do I get a protocol built here at Twitter? And at Proto and Bluesky was born, right? And really good things came out of that. And now we're off, to the races with, a vibrant protocol. We have actually 3 protocols now, which is, in and of itself a bit of a challenge. But
the fascinating thing is because they're open protocols, they're not entirely separate. I on Nostr follow thousands of people from Mastodon servers and also Bluesky servers and back and forth. And I have this weird thing where I have like my Mastodon user, my Bluesky user, my Nostr user. They all follow each other. And then I'm like, should I repost my post from one to the other? And, sometimes things get lost. I think we're in a moment where we have a creativity that's going on right now. I think that the Fediverse and ActivityPub had gotten a little stuck before Nostr and Bluesky and App Protocol came along, where people were sort of happy with where they are. They've got a really nice, relatively small set of communities. They've got the Mastodon servers that do their own moderation. And there were other protocols. You had ones around events and you had ones around photos and video and things like that are all sort of built on top of the protocol. But they didn't figure out privacy or how to separate who's hosting your identity from who's hosting your content, from who's hosting your algorithm, from who's doing your moderation. Like, it worked at the scale of a few million people, but it wasn't going to get beyond that.
I think each one of these protocols has something to offer, in terms of where we ultimately land here. I remember when email was happening, right? We had POP3, we had IMAP, right? Like the key
we never talk about those now.
Right. Well, the key is that, normal people could open up an email app and they could send an email and it just worked. Whether it went over what protocol, it's like That's for technologists to handle, and companies and things like that. The point though is that they're connected, and I can email you no matter what app you're using. That used to not be the case. If you had to use AOL and I had to use AOL in order to email each other, it's insane, right? But that's how it used to
Yeah.
be. That's how it is with messaging right now, right? With direct messaging. So what we need to do, independent of these protocols, which all have very good ideas and really great, opportunities built around them, is continue to advance the user experience so that normal people can understand. And normal people, as in like my teenage daughters, they can get on and they're not thinking like, okay, I let me pick what protocol, let me pick, they see someone that they love to hear more from. They want to connect with a creator who's got great videos, and they just follow that person, and it just works. And they can follow that person from any app, regardless of the protocol, regardless of the app, right? And we are on the threshold of that.
And we know that people want it. Like, the fascinating thing is I was at this big creator summit with all of these creators, and it was a creator economy thing, 1 billion followers. And everybody I talked to, there were two things that jumped out to me. One, even though the conference was called 1 billion followers, those creators didn't think that the people who followed them ever saw their content. They knew that their role was to game the algorithm and continuing to game the algorithm and learn how it worked as it was modified underneath them. And that was the only way they reached an audience, which is, something that I know that you've been working against, and you have recently joined the board of Patreon, which is a really important company for making the world sustainable for creators, and one in which says that the relationship between the creator and their audience should be direct and not intermediated through an ad platform, through an algorithm platform that may or may not show your content to that audience.
Yeah, that, I think one of the most important new waves of growth for the open social web will be the content creators who are tired of chasing an algorithm on all these different platforms, of having their entire audience and future and monetization strategy owned and locked in by one or two or three major companies. There's now an opportunity for content creators to build out on the open social web. That doesn't mean they have to leave YouTube or something. They'll always post on YouTube, but building out on the open social web, building their community there, gathering people around their content where they can connect with each other, where their users, their audience members can talk to each other. Again, independent of app, independent of platform. That, I think, is going to create a whole new wave of growth for the open social web. And that's happening at a time of great need for content creators, because they're as you pointed out, right there, you can get all the follows you want on X. Does that mean that anyone's going to see your post when you post? It's up to Elon to decide whether, are you going to see cat turd, or are you going to see, the creator that you followed? Like, that's the thing that I think is shocking, right? Is like, creators don't have agency on any of these platforms. They're completely beholden to whoever is running them. So if they want to build a business, that's just crazy. So there's a real need for these creators to find an alternative to really build something that's sustainable.
And the moments that we do see bits of these algorithms, X recently open sourced some of their algorithms, some of the stuff they're doing for how the algorithm works. And it optimizes a certain kind of rage bait engagement farming. The more you post stuff on things, the more engagement you have, the more in which you have people click in and angrily reply, the more attention it gets. And the less you link out to the open web, the better. They don't want you leaving at all. And it's like, oh, now I can see why they've optimized for this wrong thing. And you see it on Threads too, which is nominally part of the Fediverse, part of this open ecosystem, but with an algorithm that it's so driven by engagement farming. This thing, a few weeks ago, I guess it's more than a month ago now, there was this resonant computing manifesto, which I believe you co-signed too.
And I did co-sign that. Yes.
Yeah. And the experience we see on Twitter and on Threads and on Instagram and TikTok with these arguments, it's the opposite of that resonance computing thing. So I wonder if you could talk about what the idea was, and this idea of people in tech and in Silicon Valley trying to reset our relationship to these platforms.
Cory Doctorow talks about enshittification. There are sort of two components that cause that phenomenon, right? One of them is that, the users can't leave. They're trapped. And then the second one is that now they're taken advantage of, right? They're surveilled. They're pummeled with ads. The key part is enabling people to fix this. You have to allow people to move, to leave, to change, and to go somewhere else, but not lose all their connections, all their content, their reputation, their presence, their monetization. And that is fundamental. That is fundamental to preventing the kind of abuse that we see happening on X or on other platforms. And this is, left unchecked, you can see what happens, right? The business model for Twitter requires more ad inventory. To get more ad inventory, the algorithms will optimize for the posts that have the most comments. The posts that have the most comments are oftentimes the rage bait. And then even now with X, Elon will share revenue with the content creator who has all these comments. So of course you're inspired to create rage bait as a creator on X, not just for your post to be seen, but for you to be monetized, for you to actually have monetization. So now you're incentivized to do rage bait, right? And so It's just mind blowing. And then of course, why would they want you off the platform? Because now you're not looking at the ads, you're not looking at the ad inventory. So there's, ultimately you have to be able to monetize, and advertising can be done in a way that isn't like this. But because users can't leave, because they're like, well, if I don't go on X, I don't know what's happening, they're trapped, right? And so then the cycle continues. And this has been the story of every major social media walled garden. And this is what obviously we're working so hard to change. And finally, I think there's alternatives that are happening, which, are actually going to be not just comparable experiences, but fundamentally better experiences than what we see on X.
Yeah, and it's fascinating the way in which you cannot move on your own. Unless you're in an open system that allows the interoperability and the right to exit, the way the Fediverse, Nostr, Blue Sky, all of these new protocols do, if you have to find something to trigger a community to move. And so we saw some communities move over to Blue Sky. We saw, the queer community long ago move a lot of its stuff to Mastodon and find a home there. But we also saw people who you wouldn't expect, like Swifties, didn't like the way in which Grok and other, AI image generation stuff were what they were doing to Taylor Swift. And so they en masse moved. And who would have thought that the Swifties would go and adopt Blue Sky? It's fascinating, but it took something quite intense to drive them. Blue Sky went from 3,000 daily active users before the last election to 1 million. And it was because people knew it was there, but Elon's active role in getting Trump elected pushed people over the edge.
100%. And that's one form of growth for the social web, people looking for alternatives because the thing that they were using, they're disgusted with. And that's okay. That's good. That's been a good form of growth, as we've seen. I think that to have this growth sustain and to continue, what we need to do is create a place for creators who have the kind of content and communities that people want to be a part of and want to gather around. For those people to be able to, adopt the social web, tell their audiences, come follow me over on the social web. And I think that will lead to a more sustainable growth wave where it isn't just a growth wave built on dissatisfaction and looking for an alternative. It's a growth wave built on there's better things here that I want to be a part of. And that I think is the exactly. And that's really the thing that I've been very, very focused on, is creating that environment such that can happen. So you can have these niche communities built around content creators who are they're simply to serve their communities, not chase an algorithm, and who will always have maintained those connections with each other, independent of platform, independent of app. And that is, I think, going to lead to a 100 or 1,000-fold increase in the social web growth than what we've seen to date.
One of the things I think is so fascinating with Flipboard is you've got this way in which, in some ways, it's an open version of what Medium is doing, with editors and curators and people finding stuff and collecting it together and giving you an experience, a curated human experience as opposed to a purely algorithmic experience. And where communities of users have a label and a name and a place you could go to. The weirdest thing with the algorithm is, like, yes, we know there are people doing all of these different things in communities, but, like, how do you point to it, and who is doing that? Is it just sort of all the magic of algorithms?
Yeah.
And what you're doing is always much more human centric.
Yeah. People who love something want to be with other people who love that same thing. And if there's somebody making great videos or has a fantastic newsletter or a great podcast about that, then they want to be around that person too. So these communities want to find each other, and people want to spend time in these smaller, communities that are more intimate, more respectful. Is about just that thing, and that's all. If you love, sailing or woodworking, like, finding that group of people that you resonate with and those creators, that is, I think, a huge, huge, huge opportunity versus a scenario where it's like, I'm in one feed and I follow people, but they post about all sorts of things. And then I see other people coming into that feed, and it's like this one global town square, which is a use case for social media. It's a good and valid use case. But I think that use case, is a very limited view of what you can do with the open social web. The use cases, I think, that are going to be these next gen use cases are around these niche communities forming around creators and them creating their own sustainable ecosystem. And that, to me, is very similar to, AOL. Back in the days when AOL was dominant, and then the web started to happen, if everyone just built a clone of AOL on HTML and HTTP, I don't think we'd be here with the web today, right?
No, it had to do something different, something native to the new platform.
Exactly. And that, I think, that idea of new ways to gather people and content together on the web, in ways that are more niche, that are more sort of pure and genuine, I think that's the future. And so the key is to enable, apps and experiences like that then I think we'll look at, like, X, as a kind of a social media experience. But I think where you'll see most people spend most of their time will be within these communities, which also, by the way, will not be dominated by bots. Nobody's going to want to follow an AI bot. No one's going to want to, interact with a community that's primarily AI, right, driven. They want human connection, right? They want an actual connection to an actual person, an actual creator. And, maybe they'll use AI to sort through all that stuff to discover that. But the connection to real, genuine people and genuinely good content is what people are thirsting for now.
Yeah, it's part of why Sora and Meta AI, these sort of AI-only platforms, feel so soulless, is because the content is beautiful, but there's no humanity behind it. And it's funny because we're now seeing this trend of people being nostalgic for 2016, this era of the internet and of social media before Trump became a major political force, before he was elected president, before we had Cambridge Analytica, before sort of this halcyon days of the past. And what we see is people not wanting perfect cameras and perfect edited shots. There's a desire for the authentic and the raw and the human as a way of reclaiming space against a world created by and for AI.
Exactly. I'm seeing this, with my kids and their friends. They all get those, like, cameras from the late 90s or the early 2000s. There's more of a sense of, like, the craft of something is actually very much a part of being human, having everything done for you at the push of a button, having you not have to think, having, this leads to a very shallow existence. And I think we're seeing a new generation of, thank God, of people who are like, this isn't actually how we should live. Having, a sense of, tools where you learn how to use them. There's a sense of craftsmanship. You create something that's unique, something that's genuine. There's a premium for that there because too much of what we see now isn't that. And, I think the thing that's great is the power of the human, dynamic is it's so powerful. It will overcome a lot of these challenges that we see, but we need tools to help unlock that at scale, for people to be able to gather in new ways and share content in ways, creations in ways that are not, subservient to these algorithms and aren't made with, a push of a button, because that's not interesting. Ultimately, we're at it both perilous and promising moment. And, this is where I think the role of technologists and product builders come in, right? So how can we tap into that and enable that to happen at this really, really key moment?
And it's so fascinating because we're also at a moment where the cost of building, especially the prototype, the first version of it, building new technology has gotten an order of magnitude faster and easier. I remember back in, the advent of Web 2.0 was in large part driven by the adoption of technologies like JSON, like Ruby on Rails, like Django, basically a whole set of technologies that was built from about 2001 to 2005, 2006 that made building technology and building apps and building websites much easier. We're seeing a similar wave with AI in terms of coding where you can just whip up a tool that does everything else, and in my own case, I've been doing this podcast, interviewing people and people talking about the history of social media, and several people brought up Vine, and then there was this podcast, Vine, 6 Seconds to Change the World, and I'm like, oh my God, what happened to this thing? And I went to Jack and I'm like, hey, what happened? He's like, oh, I don't know. Twitter was hard to manage, and we were going to lose money, and then he's like, I wish I hadn't shut it down. Which is easy to do in hindsight when you're not running a publicly traded company and having to hit quarterly returns. And so I was just like, well, what if I just vibe coded a Vine-like app? How hard could it be to build a 6-second app that did video stuff and everything else? And I got it sort of working and played with it. And then I was like, I wonder what happened to those videos. And so I went and just spent some time, and I was able as one person to build a prototype that felt pretty much like what a $30 million company would have taken to build, a decade ago. And I put it out there in November with no expectation that it would have a big impact. I thought, people on the Fediverse would like it. I thought you would think it was cool and people interested in emerging technologies or internet history. And what blew me away was all of these people who knew nothing about the process we're building of the open web. They knew nothing about protocols. They knew nothing about the things. All they heard was you bring back the videos, the Vines, and you filter out the AI. And like hundreds of millions of people in a couple days saw videos about it and shared it and liked it. And it made me realize that we speak in a little bit of an echo chamber amongst ourselves. And yet there are all these billions of people who are out there using the things we're creating.
Yes, it's very easy. And unfortunately, I think oftentimes is the case when you're in the early phases of a technology revolution, is that people are ending up talking more about the technology than, really, just the use cases themselves are the reason why, people are adopting it, not because of the technology or some of the first principles around the tech, right? So I agree with that, and I'm glad that you saw that. I was on Divine this morning and checking it out, and there's all sorts of really cool videos, both new and old, and this point around creating these kind of artistic constraints. Having the constraint of like you can't AI generate the video; it is just a short video. That actually is what leads to the creativity, right? When you can do anything, then you just get stuck. You can tell it's soulless, as you said, right? So, but when people have to, like, within those creative limitations, innovate on content, on creating something interesting, that's when you unlock all this, like, magic of what humans can do, right? And so it is very, really heartwarming to see how that's played out on Divine.
To me, it's mind-blowing that so many people are interested into it, and that after all these years of work, and they're just seeing these two things. They're just seeing the videos and no AI. And we have all the documentation about everything else, and it's on GitHub, and there's links and everything else. But what blew me away was just how much of that was what we needed to do as technologists, as people who are building these things, figure out how to communicate that, like communicate what it is that people really want. And it's funny because, you've seen it several times, like when you saw Netscape blow up and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And you're like, how far could this go? Netscape itself stayed part of the open web and eventually became part of Mozilla, which, is Firefox, and this amazing open source company. How do we protect this next generation of things we're building on these open protocols? How do you keep, Flipboard and the apps you're building? You have the Surf app, which is a rethinking of what it is to be a social browser, what it is to collaborate. It's super fascinating, and we can experiment with this. But how do we set up constraints that we don't mess it up in the future?
Well, again, I think the most important is that people need to be able to leave whatever the one app is and use a different app or a combination of apps or platforms and not be tied into something, which is like the core first principle, right? The challenge is, how do you do that in a way from a user experience point of view that people understand what's happening? It can be overly complex for folks.
It can be really complicated.
Right. And but that said, that's it can be overcome. Like if you look at, the browser, people used to think, okay, I have to type HTTP:/. I was like, that alone, and that's still to this day, right? Domain names and how a browser URL bar works. Like now it's ingrained in society, but like there are certain things that I think become ultimately expectations. And so if you can get use cases, if the use case, the content and the reason for going there is attractive enough, people will figure this stuff out. And ultimately they'll look at the world that we have today with social media walled gardens as bizarre, because like, why would it be that if I switch my phone, that now you can't call me on the same number anymore? And also I lost all my contacts, but I just wanted to like get an Android phone instead of an iPhone, right? Like that's insane.
Or switch
right?
from one cell phone provider to another. Like you used to have to get a new phone number when you did that.
Right, exactly. So the thing is, I think there is a natural desire for us and it's a fundamentally better state of being online, right? If we can make that happen. So now what we have to do is create use cases, experiences that are incredibly attractive to, like I said, my teenage daughters, right? And their friends. They should not join the social web because they want to join the social web. They should join the social web because that's how they're going to see these great videos from this creator that they love. That's what needs to happen.
I mean, that was the amazing thing when I handed, especially teenagers and people in their early 20s. These are mostly people who were too young to use Vine. When I handed them to Vine and I said, hey, look at this app I built. Honestly, this was the first time my kids thought I built anything like a cool app. Like at one point they said, Dad, you make boring, stupid social media apps. But right. When I showed them Divine and talked about it, they were excited about it. They had fun with it. And it was because they knew about the videos. We didn't have to explain anything. They had seen these videos in compilations and everything else, and they knew it was like this sort of weird lost app. And we didn't have to do much cognitive load to it. But what has me excited about it, other than those videos, I mean, that'll bring people in, but like in terms of like the Fediverse, we have this model, especially that comes from the Blue Sky folks, where they've just said usernames are domains. And to me, that is so powerful. And we don't really have it in the Mastodon world. We don't really have it in the Nostr world. But the Blue Sky folks said, we're going to build a naming system where it's just your name, and you can own your domain name, or the New York Times could give different subdomains. And that is so powerful because people don't have to know what a DID is. They don't have to know what an identifier is. They don't have to understand what an account is, or, Blue Sky has cryptographic keys the same way Nostr does under the hood. But I mean, no one has to know that it's there. Whereas Nostr is like, here, let me give you a book on cryptography and but what I wanted to talk through with you is think about is like, okay, so your username is a domain name and you should host your experience and you want people to come to you. How can we build that social experience and build what is at those domain names in a really useful way? Because I feel like this is just a tremendous opportunity that we haven't quite touched on, which is like, if your username is a domain, why isn't there a Linktree-like site? Why isn't there an aggregation? Why isn't there like, this is everything about me?
100%. That is, so that is, now you're getting into the kind of work that we're doing around Surf. Our goal with Surf is to allow people to build communities around great content and content creators, podcasters, YouTubers, newsletters, and then, gather, political leaders and, technologists or product builders, or if it's, if it's a community for like backpacking, other backpackers and great backpacking videos and great backpacking podcasts, to build those communities in a way that allows anyone to join them from any app on the social web, to be able to follow the people, to be able to communicate with them without having to think about it, regardless of the protocol under the hood. And that's critical. And that's step one, is building those communities. And then the other component is enabling people to have, exactly like what you say, a presence on the social web, particularly for creators.
That's theirs.
Right. These are all of my podcast episodes, my YouTube, my videos, all of my photos, where I'm posting with different apps, all in one place, and can be discovered on a domain, on a website that people can just go to and then see everything that creator has to offer. Hit the follow button and it just works, right? Again, regardless of whether you're using Blue Sky or you're on the Fediverse or you're using Nostr. So the goal is to create that kind of experience where people, creators, individuals, they have a reputation and an identity that they care about. That they, when people follow them, they earn that followership and can maintain it forever. And that will lead to very different dynamics, right? You'll still always have anonymous users and things, but because there's a role for that, obviously, but for people who want to build a reputation and identity online that they can actually own, and they can make it sustainable, and they can monetize however they want to or don't want to, that is ultimately where we're headed. And when you pair that up with communities that can be built around great, that gather great, interesting content with really interesting people, that, I think, that dynamic is what we're trying to enable with Surf. And then, you can use Surf to go and surf any of those communities and look at any of those profiles. But you can also use Blue Sky. You can use Nostr. You can use any other kinds of apps or protocols to be able to engage with that experience. That is really our focus.
Yeah, and that's so powerful. One powerful that the creators have a space that they can own stuff and they create it, they curate it, but also that people can come in who are not creating primary content, but they're curating it, they're bringing it together.
Yeah.
That is really important. Like, it shouldn't just be some anonymous algorithm that's doing it. Like, we used to have Delicious that was bookmark management, and we had, Reddit and Dig before it. Like, it was sharing links. It was communicating around. Like, the reason that Google Reader and the RSS Reader died was not because Google killed it, Google killed it after everyone switched to the social answer, after everyone switched to using Twitter. But now we can't trust Twitter to show us our friends' links.
That's right. And, Rabble, you're getting at such an important point here because, if I follow you, regardless of the protocol, okay, I have a follow relationship with you. I know you're going to post stuff that's interesting. This is why I'm following you, right? You now basically...
You want to see it.
Right. I want to see it because I trust you and I trust your reputation. You have a reputation on the social web that you've earned and built over years. And as a result, I want to follow you and see what you're posting. And when you post stuff, that's important to me. And I'm going to look at it because you're effectively endorsing, you're curating of all the content I could be seeing, right? You personally are selecting this because you thought this was important and useful or interesting to you, right? So that dynamic of humans recommending content to other humans is ultimately the big solve for AI, right? When we think about how do content creators get discovered in a world of AI, where all the answers are just automatically created and put in front of a user, and the background content that was used to create those answers is just background. As far as the AI is concerned, now creators aren't getting discovered. We've seen a massive drop off in SEO. We've seen a massive drop off in just the models and ways in which people have been discovered in the past. And so now we need a new model. And the ultimate is to have people be able to connect to other people that they trust and rely on that network for discovery. And that's how it's always, that's how the early internet, worked, when blogs would recommend other blogs. And that's how you discovered other bloggers. And that is what we are actually at the point of being able to do now.
I think you were at this event, the Social Web Foo Camp, back in 2007, 2008. And I remember having a conversation with David Ricordan, who had been at LiveJournal, one of the sort of classic indie social things, that he had gone over to Facebook. And he said to me, Rabble, no, the goal of Facebook is just you publish every kind of thing to the Facebook timeline and they'll decide what you can see. And I remember thinking that he was crazy to say this. Crazy to say this thing where, like, all of a sudden, instead of the human agency of deciding, do I want to share this with other people? Is this worthy of communicating it? It was like, no, our algorithms will figure this all out. Just give us all the data in the world, and we're going to be the intermediaries. And it took a long time for that to go off the rails because, it took like 7 or 8 years even before Cambridge Analytica. But now we're in a world where you can't trust anything you see online, and that's really scary. And I think the solution is to not abandon the technology, but focus in the humans, the human curators, the human connection, being able to actually follow people and everything else. And, maybe they want to share AI-generated content, but it's a real person sharing it.
Right. And that, we talk often as technologists around identity, right? And that is obviously fundamental to how all of this works. The did being fundamental to that, under the hood. But what I think we need to also be talking about is reputation. How does someone build a reputation such that they're going to act in a way that, is sort of like how they would act if they were out in public at a conference, right? And in a way where people can then discover that person and know that that person is going to be sharing content, recommending, curating content that is great content, that's actually, worth looking at, right? So once you own your connections to each other, you now have the opportunity to build reputation, right? Versus like, I may have had a great reputation on X, but now I'm going to join TikTok and I'm starting from scratch, right? And so the idea of, investing in something that you care about for the entire time of your online existence is like something we've never had, right? That concept alone. And again, there is certainly a need for anonymity and the ability for people to have an anonymous, ways to access the internet from time to time and for different use cases. But there's also a need for that idea of, I know it's you. I know the kind of content that you share, and now I can follow you. And regardless of any app you use or I use, I'm always going to see the things that you're sharing and that you think are important. So that establishing that is going to lead to a very different kind of online experience, or how we feel about, when we're online. It'll feel more collaborative. It'll feel more healthy. This is also for fun too, right? So they'll the things that my daughters are going to recommend are fundamentally funny or interesting or fun to do, right? And that's what their friends want to see, right? Not a bunch of AI slop that an algorithm puts out in front of them, right? So it all comes back to that sense of like reputation and curation as a kind of a enabling that to happen at scale.
We need to give people power over that. We need to give people agency. Both of us have in our podcast sat down and interviewed Rudy from Black Sky.
Yeah, Rudy's fantastic.
Where Rudy is doing such important work about making the Blue Sky ecosystem open and diverse and multiple implementations of it, where you can interact with it in a set of technologies and servers that have a different set of values and a different set of people controlling them. And you have agency to choose that. You're like, I want this. I want these moderators. I want these people to have my servers. I trust them. And then you can build on that to say, okay, this trust is contextual and it is based on social proof and connection, not some algorithmic thing. At this billion followers thing, there were all of these brands, and there were these brand advertisers and everything else, and there were the creators of AI creators. And so these are entirely fake AI content things that have generated millions and millions of followers and hundreds of millions of views. And to me, the fascinating thing, the brands, they don't care that it's not a real person. In fact, the brands like that it's not a real person, because real people have things going on in their lives and they do things that aren't on brand. And if it's an entirely AI prompt generated thing, they'll never post anything that's off brand. And it's this weird dystopian world of sanitized brand marketing. And you're like, why did we get that? Wait, what the hell are we going for here?
I think there are some really promising examples of this all starting to happen now. To me, again, this is why I'm so optimistic about the future of the internet. One reason why I joined the Patreon board is I've seen how Patreon can be a way where entire communities can exist that just wouldn't have been able to exist otherwise. There's a great example. There's a YouTuber who is also a shipbuilder, a boat builder, and he bought this boat called Tally Ho for $1. It's this like 85-foot old classic boat. It's like 100 years old. And he basically had to tear it all down and build it all back up from scratch. And, this would normally cost millions of dollars to do something like that, a project like that. And, he took that project on and he started posting videos about how that was going. And what was amazing is that, and he had a Patreon so people could support him. And people were so enthusiastic, this small niche community of people who love boat building and the classic skills of like woodworking and so on. And then they're thirsting for something that's real and tangible and not digital. And so, here's this guy in this boatyard building this boat with a bunch of people that then he discovered him through the internet, and then getting support with Patreon to build it. And now he's single-handedly, helped refresh the whole classic boat building, craftsmanship and community. And, he's now sailing around the world with it and, earning a living with it. He's built this highly sustainable community. Other content creators or other boat builders have spun off and made their own boat building projects. This would never have happened without the internet. It never would have happened without something like Patreon. The opportunity, you can see it even happening in these walled garden ways, in these walled garden platforms now. But to have that happen at much more scale. So it's a sort of normal thing for someone to do is to go pursue something that they're passionate about, create interesting content around that, build a community around it, and fund the whole effort, over a sustainable, long-term period. that is really, I think, the end state for where we want to get to with all these different protocols.
Yeah, and so many of these creators, they don't have huge audiences. Like, it just takes 1,000 super fans who love what you're doing and are excited about it, and they want to be part of it. They want to participate, and they're able to do that by helping support it in Patreon. The amazing thing that blew me away is we have this tremendous long tail of creators, and the vast majority of it, like Patreon, is so important for it. But then you have people getting huge amounts of views, and these platforms are making billions of dollars a quarter, tens of billions of dollars a quarter. And almost none of it ever filters down to the creators whose content they're using around. The reason you're there is not for the ads. You're not there for the creators. And so all of these creators now have built businesses that aren't dependent on the ad revenue. We have this weird parasitic relationship with the ads and the platforms where the creators are making their money. Mr. Beast sells chocolate, or the boat builder has the super fans. And then the question is, like, why do we need these big platforms? Why, how hard can it be to build out the algorithms, to build out the discovery, build out the hosting and all these other things so that we can do it together? Because if the business model of the creators isn't dependent on the ads, then why do we have these platforms with ads in the first place?
There's no one business model for the internet, and there shouldn't just be one business model for social media, which is kind of how we've gotten to it. And I think there's a real opportunity for lots of different ways to mix and match content and provide discovery for all sorts of different apps. And some of those apps may be, powered by ads. Some might be subscription based. Some may be free. But the point is that there's lots of different ways to get to the discovery, right? There's not just one algorithm with one app and you're not locked in. One of the things that, credit to YouTube is they have very much invested in their RSS and their API such that, you can have a bunch of YouTube videos appear in another app. Now, admittedly, it's using the YouTube player, but, still, at least there is a way to have apps surface YouTube videos. You see YouTube videos all the time on Bluesky, on Surf, on Flipboard. It shows like there is, by even having just even that limited amount, of openness, it creates all sorts of new discovery opportunities for creators. And so and it doesn't mean that a creator, has to leave YouTube. YouTube has value. There's all sorts of things that YouTube can do to help creators. But what you don't want to have is, hey, I'm stuck on YouTube. I have to be on YouTube. And there's no way for me to, have my content discovered unless my users are also on YouTube.
Well, and the fascinating thing is I had all these discussions with creators since I announced Divine and before that. And YouTube is the one platform they're like, look, if I put up long form content and I have an audience and millions of people view it and I turn on the monetization and there are ads, I get real revenue from the ads on my videos. Like, YouTube is the one platform that's actually sharing with people. And the question is, like, YouTube does a good job of this. YouTube does a way of connecting. But the rest of the platforms are trying to sort of lock these people into this walled garden where the creators can't put links to their content. This is not a good world that we find ourselves in. And yet we have an alternative, finally.
I think that's, very short-sighted thinking. That, will continue on at some level for, several more years, I think. But again, I think that the more creators realize that they can build out on the social web, that it's easy to do that. They don't have to do it as a choice. They don't have to say, oh, I have to leave YouTube and now I can build out on in order to build out on the social web. No, that you can continue to do what you're doing and post what you're doing, but this is additive. And it's additive strategically for you as a content creator, because now when people follow you, you can have that following relationship independent of platform forever. And that, as more creators realize that will force the hand of these other walled gardens. So, I think that at some point, X and Instagram and others, their hands will be forced and they will have to ultimately integrate with the open social web. Just as AOL ultimately had to create a window to the internet and then eventually became just part of the internet, right? So
Absolutely.
this is a powerful movement that's more powerful than any one of these platforms.
I've seen it with the Divine launch. I announced Divine, and then there were press releases from TikTok and Instagram about how they were going to add settings to filter out all the AI generated content if you wanted to, and transparency around the algorithms and the ability to modify your algorithms and choose which ones are. And I'm sure that some of those projects had been in the work for a long time, but they announced it pretty quickly after we got the attention around Divine. And I think that if we build a viable alternative, if they start seeing people leave, then they will follow that path and they will open up. It's one of those things where we lose, and we keep getting off of the things, and then we finally get enough of the pieces working, and then the social dynamics of these platforms drive forward in a way that's really powerful and more powerful than the technology that we're building.
Yeah, that's right. These are very powerful social dynamics. If you are a young person today and you think about what is your career, you have now an option to I want to make great, tell great stories on the internet. I want to make videos. I want to write. We're now at a point where you can actually do that in a sustainable way. It used to be if you want to write, you're going to have to get a publishing deal, with someone who to publish your book. That's no longer the case, right? And so how can we build out for that next generation of content creators so that they can not just tell great stories, but build communities around those stories? And that's such a natural human instinct. People gathering around campfires telling stories has been part of human existence since we became human, right? So the concept of this is it's a very powerful way of being online, and I think it is going to overpower all these limitations that these walled gardens have put to build their own profitable businesses, and the right things will ultimately happen. So and I think the technology explosion, we now have 3 protocols that enable you to do this. We're starting to center around an identity model with DIDs, which is also a W3C standard. We are, starting to get lots of different kinds of user experiences that are capturing this, like Divine, Skylight, which is, open alternative to TikTok built on App Proto.
Yep.
We've got, Mastodon, we've got, Bluesky, Flipboard, Surf. There's a lot of these experiences. There are thousands of developers tinkering, innovating, experimenting with how to mash up all these different things into all these different experiences. So I do feel like there is this the technology is going to enable this fundamental human desire to gather together and tell stories, and it'll be sustainable. And ultimately, the walled gardens will I think people will look back on it 5 to 10 years from now and say, that was odd that we all lived in that world.
They seem inevitable when it's there, but then, then it collapses. This is the Ursula Le Guin quote about, the divine right of kings seemed like something that would exist in perpetuity and was unchanging, and yet it was replaced. And now it seems like an anachronism. And the walled gardens that we have today, her quote was about capitalism, but the walled gardens we have today are this thing where they've seen like this inevitable thing that we can't escape. And yet we can't escape it, and we are.
There is a real risk today of a techno-feudalism that, we could see with billionaires, trillionaires controlling everything that we see online. And so there is a need, to, as quickly as possible, as effectively as possible, build out the open social web as a counterforce to that techno-feudalism that is growing. So there is like I said, it's both a perilous and promising time that we're in right now. It really is a defining moment for not just the internet, but for how we exist as a society, as a connected society. It's really important work, and it's, incredible to be part of this movement and, collaborating with you and others, to help make this world happen.
Yeah, and I think that, that's such a great way to wrap it up. And to people who are listening, there is so much to be done around this that isn't just for the programmers, because the code isn't the only thing. Like, the truth of the matter is these things are living, breathing communities. The use of it, the connection to it, building communities on it, and making it work is what makes it live. It's, it's the vibrancy of a city. And so what we're doing is we're trying to redesign the digital urbanism of our lives.
Totally. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this time. Thank you so much for all of your work, all the way going back to the early web and Netscape, and the efforts to keep Twitter on the open space, even though it ended up losing its open things, and all of the work promoting the Fediverse and open protocols, Flipboard, Surf. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you, Rabble, and right back at you. Thanks for inspiring everybody here with this podcast and the work that you've done as well. I'll see you on the social web.
Yep, and for everyone who wants to hear more from Mike, check out .social. It's a fantastic podcast, interviews tons of amazing people about these very issues. Thanks again to Mike McCue for coming on revolution.social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
This episode was edited and produced by Eric Johnson from lightningpod.fm. Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan from Flock Marketing.
To learn more about the Social Media Bill of Rights and sign up for our email newsletter, visit revolution.social.
And for more interviews like this one, follow revolution.social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Nostos, Fountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatistas' Subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back next week. See you then.